Hello, dear friends of Kabbalah International. We are again with Mario.
How are you, Nacho?
Very well, very happy.
Likewise.
Ready to talk about the topic of guilt and responsibility. Doing a little analysis of how to prepare the topic, I thought I would propose to start with what the Talmud tells us about the story of Rabbi Elazar, who was a person who had a certain fixation for carnal pleasures. And in an opportunity he goes to visit a person who was dedicated to prostitution. And at the moment he is with this person, the person tells him that his soul is not, shall we say, prepared for salvation and for the world to come. Elazar goes into a rather deep state of affliction and goes and starts asking the various entities of nature, the mountain, the sky, the moon, the sun, to intercede with the Creator for his salvation. Obviously, all these entities tell him that they cannot intercede, that they are only willing to work for their own salvation, with the arguments of each one of them. At that moment he enters into despair. He is deeply distressed, and with a stark cry, he assumes that everything depends on him, and that the responsibility is absolutely his. And at that very moment he hears a voice telling him that your repentance was accepted and you are worthy of the world to come.
Look, there are many issues here because it seems curious to me that the story does not want to save the prostitute. There is a very interesting twist because for Tamar to have become pregnant by her father-in-law, she dressed as a prostitute, and the Torah accepts this with great joy. Then too, when the people of Israel enter the promised land. In Jericho, the only woman who is saved is Rahab, who is a prostitute. It means that the idea of the question of prostitution as a negative comes especially in Rabbinical Judaism and Christianity. And you extract a story that comes from that time. But in the Torah text, prostitution is not so frowned upon, because the man who went with the prostitute did not desire his neighbor's wife, since the prostitute does not belong to any neighbor. Consequently, what we should think about the story you say is, first, to analyze the change of paradigm. In the 2nd and 3rd century, with Christian monasticism and certain repressive ideas of Judaism, and certain repressive ideas of Rabbinical Judaism, the idea of prostitution changes completely. First, it is curious that this story does not seek the redemption of the prostitute from her prostitution. It seeks that of the rabbi. Second, why does God leave Rahab the prostitute as redeemed from death in Jericho? Why does she act as a spy? And the question is, why does God accept a prostitute as a spy and save the family? And then, why does God accept that Tamar dresses as a prostitute in order to procreate? All this leads us that prostitution was a valid trade in ancient times, and that the Torah does not judge it. I think that to me what is happening here is that what is being judged here is that what is being judged is not the going to the prostitute on the part of that narrative. What is being judged is the disorganization of life that this rabbi has.
Indeed.
So, it seems to me that for those who are listening to us, it would be necessary to divide clearly the need for a woman to have to exercise this profession from this disorganization of life on the part of this man, because otherwise, also the story would be like sending the prostitute to hell, and he doesn't do it. So, first of all, I think we have to make it clear to those who are listening that prostitution is not condemned in the Old Testament, it is not condemned in the Torah, for all that we have explained, but it is condemned in Rabbinic Judaism and in 2nd century Christianity. Having said that, we must move on to another topic, which is the key issue of what we are seeing, which is guilt and responsibility. And the first irresponsible one is Adam. Because look at what Adam does when Eve feeds him. When God appears, he says, "The woman you gave me has given it to me, and I have nothing to do with it." So we symbolically descend from an irresponsible person. We descend from a being who, at the first situation of comprehension of his own responsibility, says, "No, the woman you gave me is." And the woman says, "No, the serpent gave it to me." Each one was throwing the responsibility to the other. Nobody was taking responsibility that he had eaten with conscience. It was by the induction of the other. So I would say to you that the first irresponsibility is in Genesis. The first irresponsible is Adam. And the second irresponsible one is Eve, because they are transferring the responsibility. Here we are talking about responsibility, which means to assume, in some way, the value or the repentance of your own acts. And in general, human beings, and you can see it in Genesis, but you can see it throughout history, it is very difficult for them to assume responsibility. It is very difficult for him to take responsibility. And not taking responsibility, what does it imply in essence? It implies that you cannot see your imbalances. If I send my responsibility to the other, I am not taking responsibility for my imbalances, because I may not see them as imbalances. That is, sometimes the situation that I do not see them is not intentional. That is why many people go to a psychologist, to a coach, to find out what imbalances they have, because sometimes they do not see them themselves. Others see them more quickly than you do. So, first question, to be responsible, you have to know what you are responsible for. If you do not know what imbalances you have, what will you be responsible for? Therefore, before responsibility, there must be awareness of your imbalances. Without awareness of your imbalances, you are irresponsible, but unintentionally irresponsible. If you want to be responsible, first you have to have awareness to become responsible, and to have awareness, you have to understand what your imbalances are. Therefore, if there is no deep self-knowledge on the part of each one of us, we will not be able to be responsible. On the part of each one of us, of what our structure of imbalances is, who is going to be responsible? No one will be. So responsibility goes hand in hand with a root of conscience. In guilt, we are dealing with a totally different subject, which unfortunately gets mixed up, but it is absolutely different. Because guilt comes from a lack of acceptance of our imperfection. In other words, guilt and responsibility, which seem to are two related issues, come from, as it were, two different places. The responsibility of the matrix of not recognizing our imbalances, but the guilt comes from that self-demand on a scale that is impossible to fulfill, from that idea of doing something perfect without accepting ourselves as imperfect. It means that there are people who feel guilty at all times for never doing things right, because the bar they have to do things well is so high that they never do them well. In other words, the perfectionist never achieves total perfection because the idea of total perfection does not exist. This means that who feels guilty about everything is the one who never manages to satisfy perfectionism. Therefore, how can guilt be eliminated? Guilt is achieved if we accept our imperfection. Accepting our imperfection does not imply to cancel the liability, and that is where the two issues come together. When I accepted my imperfection, what I'm accepting in addition to my imperfection, of having mercy with my own imperfection, is to accept my power of imperfectibility. That is to say, I can do better and better. When I'm irresponsible, it is that I had to have some guidelines, coherent guidelines of conscience to carry out this work. So I am between the responsibility of the Geburah and the mercy of Jesed. The mercy of Jesed tells me, forgive yourself because you are imperfect. And the Geburah tells me to take responsibility because you could do better. And both have to oscillate. I have to forgive myself because I am imperfect. But because I have to do my best, I have to hold myself accountable. If I'm hyper-responsible, I can blame myself. Therefore, I don't have to fall into hyper-responsibility because I will generate guilt. And the one who feels guilty never forgives himself. Therefore, in order to forgive yourself, do not feel guilty. And in order to be responsible, not to feel guilty either. Because the problem is that the guilty person does not take responsibility either. This person carries a guilt, sustains a guilt, and instead of investing his energy in making things better, this person has to carry a guilt that he cannot get rid of. That is to say, guilt would be a permanent energy-wasting element because guilt sucks all your energies when those energies should be invested in responsibility.
In relation to the two things we talked about previously, and let's say the answer you gave me in relation to the Talmud story, my reading of this is that according to the Talmud story, the prostitute does not really need to be saved. The prostitute is merely an instrument. She is an instrument that allows her to Elazar to access a level of consciousness that he didn't have. Why? Because her imbalance, as you rightly said, was basically related to his excessive attachment to the pleasures of the flesh. That is to say, the problem was not that he went to the prostitute, the problem was that imbalance. To clarify simply
the commandment is, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And whose neighbor's prostitution is it?
No
neighbor.
One, none, that's
so,
why.
When you are desiring her, that's why I say, analyzing the text of the Torah is much more revolutionary than the betrayal that came later. Then came Christianity and Rabbinical Judaism, and they started to complicate everything morally when there was a situation of more common sense in biblical times than in post-Christian times.
Yes, but even so, trying to be benevolent with this story, I think it is useful, let's say, to understand and to be able to visualize the imbalance of this man and not in a sinful matter regarding the prostitute. And then what I was saying about Adam as if he was irresponsible. Well, I believe that neither Adam nor Jabba was responsible. But why were they not responsible? Because the only possibility to start being responsible is to eat from the tree of good and evil. It is the only possibility to create conscience by knowing good and evil.
You can say eventually he ate because he had no conscience. Yes, but who fed him did.
Exactly. Whoever fed him
That is,
was.
when Eve ate, she was already conscious. She wanted Adam to eat, and that, as he had already eaten, he had the responsibility.
True.
Because he had conscience. Your situation is of Adam eating without consciousness. When he said that he had already eaten without conscience, he already had conscience and was inducing him. It means that Adam has some justification, because he says, I was unconscious of having eaten.
It is true.
The woman says, I was also unconscious that she gave me the serpent, but of course when she later ate, she became conscious. That is, the woman came to responsibility earlier because she ate first. True. Now the woman who came to the responsibility, induces it to eat. And we can say that she induces him to be responsible.
To be responsible and raise their awareness.
It induces him to be responsible. So the interesting thing is that everybody blames everybody else. But they actually blame the other for having achieved the consciousness of their responsibility.
Indeed.
Very curious.
Very good.
Unbelievable.
Thank you, Mario.
A big hug.